So welcome everyone. I can't see everyone on the screen, but we're glad that you've joined us for this webinar. And as we look forward to increasing our impact through generosity. So as we get started here, you are muted. Your mic is muted. We ask that you keep it muted. And then if you have questions that you would like to ask the presenters, if you would jot those into the chat feature that you see down at the bottom, and then I will pick those off and ask those of the presenters. The other thing is, if your screen doesn't look quite right, up at the top bar, you have what's called view options. Make sure that is set to fit to window. Sure your view option is set to fit to window. So I'm going to introduce, and most of you already know, Jon Wiebe, President, CEO of MB Foundation. And as he begins, he'll also be turning some things over to Bruce Jose. I think he'll have some things to say, but Jon will introduce Bruce. I guess I just kind of did, but maybe even more so. But just a word of appreciation to Jon and his team and MB Foundation for the way that they lead our MB family in teaching about generosity and also being examples of that and the work that they do and the way that they supply so many different things for our family, and exemplified by the recent Church Relief Fund and the generosity that they have for many of our churches that have been helped through that fund during this COVID-19 season. So Jon, thank you. And thank you for also your support of the U.S. conference. And looking forward to what you have to share with us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Don. It's great to be with all of you. This is not the, we're going to say over and over again, right? This isn't the setting we were hoping for, but it works. And I'm thrilled with the level of participation and the people that are coming on board and joining in these different sessions. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about generosity. I always take that opportunity when given the chance. Love to talk about money, love to talk about stewardship. Before I go too far, I do have to say happy birthday today to my wife. It's her 39th birthday, and she's on this Zoom. So there, I thoroughly embarrassed her, and at least I got that in. So later today, you can pray for me as I go home, and that's well received. So anyway, happy birthday, Lynn. Yeah, so we're going to talk about generosity, and it's an interesting season. Some of these topics get shifted a little bit, right? We're talking a lot about pivoting and about responding to the pandemic and the various things that are going on in the United States and in our world, and certainly how we talk about generosity is one of those topics that there may be some of you that are just going, man, our church needs this because income is really fallen off and we're in bad shape. Others of you are saying, how can I talk about generosity when people in our church are really hurting and struggling? And others of you are, and we've got some data that's going to show, are doing pretty good from a revenue standpoint, relatively unaffected by the pandemic. And you might just think, I don't need to talk about this at all because everything's good. Well, I want to be clear that talking about generosity is not first and foremost about the church's needs. This is a discipleship issue. It's a part, stewardship is an essential piece of discipleship. And I would suggest it's one of the greatest barometers of our spiritual journey. So let's start there with that's why we need to talk about stewardship, and specifically I want to focus on generosity, but stewardship is much broader than that, and I'll be happy to visit with you about other aspects of stewardship one-on-one if you'd like to. So a critical key to increasing impact in our churches is to increase the generosity of our pastors, our lay people, and then our churches. So we're going to explore together how to maximize generosity while growing strong disciples, but also with the reality that it's during the time of a pandemic and racial concerns and economic issues and all of that overlays and informs and causes us to think about this topic a little bit differently than we might have just a few months ago, 6 months, a year ago. Those of you that heard Aaron give us a great plenary opening message yesterday, heard him talk about we need to relinquish our rights to our reputation, to our time, to our resources, and I want to suggest to our money. And that's a key issue as we think about how can we increase our impact as Christians. Well, we can increase our impact by understanding our relationship to our money and that God owns it all, and that we are simply disciples and stewards of those resources. So piggybacking on that a little bit, I want to start with a little bit of an overview of the charitable giving landscape. What's going on around us? What are we hearing? And so I want to make this is kind of just a backdrop to what else we're going to talk about as we get more specific within the local church. So obviously, nonprofits across the U.S. have seen increased demand for services, but at the same time, they've seen a drop in charitable donations. We're seeing it being reported as much as 6% down in the first quarter of 2020. And if that continues, some are projecting that charitable giving in the United States could be down by as much as $25 billion this year. So that's a significant impact and something that we need to consider. Now, fortunately, the local church is one of the least impacted by these statistics. So I'm reading a lot of different stuff. I can't quote all of it. We're going to quote enough numbers as it is this morning, but the local church and ministries that are able to show that they're participating in providing relief and resources and focused on helping to address some of the concerns out there are seeing less impact, if any impact, or the impact might even be in the opposite direction. So this isn't all bad news. Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability is reporting that 66% of churches that they were able to survey are reporting actually similar income or higher income from this April versus last April. So phenomenal to me that that many of our churches across the United States are experiencing good news in this pandemic, that this April is actually similar income or higher than it was previously. So, but the bad news is about 14% of churches have seen a decrease in income of 20% or more. So we know it's not all good news, it's not all bad news, but we are seeing some positive trends in spite of a very significant economic downturn and impact. Now we've been able to do our own survey, and some of you may have heard about that. We surveyed MB churches in the United States, and we just thought it was really important time to kind of see what's going on and be able to report on it. So some of you may have participated in that survey, and we thank you. We had significant participation, so we think it does accurately reflect kind of our national family. So where we can during this webinar, we want to interject some of that information as a point of reference for you and to connect some of the dots. And I want to mention that an executive summary is available on our website, and at the end of the webinar, we'll direct you there so that if you want to get a copy and look at the data more, you can do that. So you don't have to write everything down. So Bruce, we've already highlighted the fact that you're with us. Thanks for participating with me in this webinar. Many of you know Bruce. Bruce heads up our lending and that portion of our ministry, as well as has his hands in many other things. So he's a familiar face. So Bruce, what does our survey tell us about how our giving is going in our churches?
Yeah, greetings everybody. Drilling down closer to home, what's been the response or the experience from our MB churches is what's reflected here now on your screen, and that MB churches, 55% reported either no change or even an increase in giving during this pandemic, during this crisis. So the previous slide kind of shaped the Giving landscape, this would be contrary to that, right? Like John mentioned, in that the giving landscape shows some decreases happening, 25 billion or 6%. ECFA, though, reports some increases, and then drilling down a little closer to home with our MB churches, we're seeing most are reporting increased giving or same giving. So that's a tremendous praise. I think it reflects some generosity being unlocked in our churches and being able to sustain some of the ministries that are happening in churches. So big praise there, along with other resources being unlocked to make that happen. Flip side, like John said, though, then 45% would report a decrease. And of those surveyed, 18% reported a decrease of over 20%. So that's a significant change for a good chunk of our churches as well. So when we talk about increasing impact, John, that's a big hurdle when all of a sudden you see your giving decrease by over 20%.
That's right. So we've got some real impetus, some motivation perhaps that maybe some of our churches haven't had before to talk about generosity. But again, while we'll continue to talk about the needs of the local church and why we need to speak about generosity and build up our disciples within our congregation, but yet it's first and foremost about our walk with Jesus, and secondly about the needs that we have. But yet I know they go hand in hand, and we have very real concerns within our local church. So we want to help you address those. So one more bit of kind of backdrop that I want to share with you. A June 30 article in USA Today had a tremendous quote that I think is helpful to all of our churches, and I'm sure reflects what many of you have been working diligently at over the last number of months. I know it reflects where MB Foundation's been focusing our time and our energy and our efforts over the last 6 months. They said in there that nonprofits must innovate, adopting virtual strategies, using technology to share their impact, and providing options for donors to giving online. Lots of good stuff there. If your church is not innovating, then you're just sitting on the sidelines. And I know you all are innovating, just trying to get up and running when we can't meet face to face, trying to figure out new ways to disciple and encourage and shepherd the flock when we're not seeing each other on Sunday morning. A major shift and pivot has to be made, but also just thinking more about virtual strategies, using technology to communicate the vision and the ministry of the church, but also using technology to help donors act on their desire to be generous. So we're going to come back to some of those ideas and concepts, but that's a great quote. Again, just encourage you, maybe with your elders, your leadership board and team, you need to talk about this. How are we innovating? What are we doing? Are we adopting new strategies? Are we starting to rest on our laurels a little bit because we're starting to meet together again? Anyway, the challenges will continue. So I encourage you to keep leaning in. Don't lose heart. We're all in this together, and God is the one that will see us through no matter our circumstances. So with that, we want to share and use as our structure for the rest of the webinar an article that I wrote a number of years ago together with a friend of mine at Generous Church, an article called 7 Attributes of a Generous Church. And that article will be fully available on our website and made available to you. We'll reference that at the end of the webinar. So we're going to talk about 7 attributes, and then we're going to weave in some of the survey data, more of the MB Church survey data, as we think it's applicable within those 7 attributes. And then also want to share some specific best practices, some, not in every category, but some best practices that we think are really important, especially in the time of this pandemic. So we hope that'll help you innovate, adopt new strategies, and some of the focus will be on technology, so that all will come together. So let's jump into the 7 attributes of a generous church. And as Don said, we invite you to put questions on chat. If, depending on what we see, we may stop and take a question. And so Bruce and Don, interrupt me if you think there's something. You want to say something, Don?
Yeah, I forgot to mention, there is a translation into Spanish of the main points in the chat feature. So if you would prefer that or need that, One Wall is doing that for us.
Yeah, wow. Thank you, Juan. I saw that coming on at first, and I was like, holy cow, you're really staying with it and providing a great service. So I was hoping you weren't communicating to me a question, because I won't be able to handle that one. So anyway, feel free to chat. We'll also have time at the end for some questions and some dialogue. I'd love to hear from you as to what you're doing to help grow a generous church. I don't have all the answers by any means. So first attribute, generous churches are led by generous leaders.
The U.S. Conference.
Okay, I don't know what else I need to say about that one, to be honest with you. I mean, this just seems like basic 101, but if you're in a church, and I know we have pastors on board, we have lay leaders in the webinar, but if you're in a church that you don't think is very generous, and you'd have to decide how to define that, but you don't think your church is very generous, I would encourage you to start by looking inwardly. Are you generous? We can't lead people where we're not already going, okay? And it's a journey, and there'll be people ahead of us on the journey, and there'll be people behind us on the journey, but we have to be going down this journey. If we want a praying church, we have to be leading and leaning in on praying so that we can lead others where we want to go. 2 Corinthians 8:7 says that we should excel in this grace of giving. And so I would ask you as leaders, as pastors, are you excelling in this grace of giving? And so rather than shifting to offerings are down and they're so-and-so, I don't think they're very generous, or whatever kinds of things that our minds can go to, just stop and do some personal self-reflection. Am I generous? Am I acting on this spirit of generosity? Am I leading by example? So take some time. Think about that after the webinar later this week. You want a generous church, you need to be generous. Now, we have some good news on that point. So, Bruce, what is the survey telling us about our leadership and our ability to be generous to them?
Yeah, the good news is that most leadership and staff have remained unaffected as far as employment and benefits go. 90% of MB churches are reporting that they have had no changes in ministry or support staff compensation. And I tell you, at the beginning of this pandemic, if you would have asked me if that would have been the number as high as it was, I don't think I would have guessed that. I wouldn't have predicted that. And so I think it leads to tremendous praise on two fronts. One, thanks be to God that you have a job, that as ministry we haven't, as support staff and lead staff, we haven't seen much reduction in benefits or layoffs or furloughs in that. 90% is a significant number, but it also has an opportunity to be, thanks to the resources that have been provided by the people in the church that have helped continue this and help sustain this during this pandemic. 90% is a tremendous number. The Unstuck group, another survey we referenced in the executive summary, reported that 17% of churches have initiated staff furloughs and layoffs. And so our MB church family appears to be doing slightly better than what that survey suggests, which is only 10% of churches have had a reduction of staff or compensation. So like you said, John, good news indeed.
Yeah, thanks. I'm so glad that our churches have been able to stay with our pastors and our staff and provide them with the support they need during this time. And of course, the PPP loan, if you've taken advantage of that, helps with that. But we're starting to see the end of that period, and so we may begin to hear different reports. And I also know that many of our pastors are bivocational, and I'm sure they've taken some hits on that side. So our heart goes out to you if you're in that situation, but pleased that our churches are staying right alongside of our staff in this way. Moving on, our second attribute here, generous churches have a strong vision of why their church exists and can communicate it effectively to their members. So we're kind of have to get your head around what we mean by a generous church. We might have many generous people in our church, and I'm sure you do, but it may not be reflected in the local church giving. They might be generous, but giving elsewhere. So for your church to truly reflect the generosity of your congregation, you need to be communicating a strong vision of why you exist, what you're about, and communicating it well. And so you have to have the vision, and then you need to communicate it well, because without that, people in your church will be generous, but they may be generous somewhere else. You catch that? People in your church growing as disciples in their faith may express their generosity by giving to other organizations, churches, ministries that they think have a stronger vision, because it's being communicated to them perhaps better, or because the vision is stronger. Either one. But so we need to be making sure that we do have a strong vision and that we're communicating it well to the people. So as we disciple them in this area of stewardship and generosity, they're then motivated to actually give to your local church and express their generosity that way. Question that came up in our webinar, some of you are probably in the webinar that we did just a couple weeks ago with Cape and Krause on church financial practices. A question came up about how do you make the ask during this pandemic? Okay, and I want to talk a little bit about that, making the ask during a pandemic. So I've got a best practice here that I would suggest, and before I give you some of that, I wanted to note that Stan Reif, who presented the webinar together with us a couple weeks ago, suggested something that I thought was really good. He said, if you're struggling with how to make the ask in your community, in your context, in light of the pandemic and all the stuff that's going on, engage some of your business leaders. Talk to them, ask them for advice and counsel in this. They may be some of your more wealthy people. They may be some of your more generous people. They may not, but they have ideas because they're creative people, they're entrepreneurs, they're financially minded. And so they may, as you engage them, they may be able to help you walk through this. So how do I make the ask during a pandemic? What do you recommend? What's your sense for the impact of the pandemic on our community? How much freedom should I have? And just getting their input on that and asking them to help you kind of shape the message in this regard. So here's some things also that he suggested, as Stan and I had a little conversation offline following the webinar. I thought this was some really good information. He said, first of all, you got to be able to answer a few questions when you make the ask. So if you're working one-on-one with someone in your church and you're wanting to encourage their generosity because of the situation that your church has encountered, they're going to have these kinds of questions. They're going to want to know, how's the church doing financially? And you need to be ready to answer that. It's not enough just to come to them and say, oh man, we're in this crisis, this pandemic. I'm worried about the offerings. Would you make an extra gift to help us out? They want to be a little bit more specific than that. Is revenue down? Is our expenses up? What's going on? And can you really articulate, at least in broad strokes at a high level, how the church is doing? What's the financial barometer of the church right now? Secondly, they're going to want you to answer the question, what cuts have been made? So it's not that they necessarily want the church to have to make financial cuts, but I think they do want to know that you're doing what you need to do as leaders, while you're also asking them to participate in the solution. It sounds very different from, we're struggling financially, would you help give so that we can keep everything going just like we always did, versus if you say, we've made these adjustments, we're trying to think strategically, we're trying to be innovative, but even within that reality, it would still really help if you were to come alongside us and make an extra gift. There are donors who are asking these kinds of questions. I'll tell you, I called up our church and said, let me know if there's financial problems during this pandemic. And it was early on, and we had this conversation. So there are donors in your church who want to help, want to be engaged, but they have these kinds of questions to help give them encouragement to move forward with some financial assistance. And then finally, what are you doing that's relevant? Okay, no one is encouraged or motivated to give to just kind of a black hole, to support the mortgage or salaries for that matter. But they do want to give to vision, as we've already discussed. And so if you can explain where you're at and how you're taking the bull by the horns, but also communicate a vision. I mean, at the end of the day, they want to know that they can trust you as a leader and that you have vision for where God is calling your church. And then if you can answer that, they're going to jump on board. So I hope that that's helpful to you and encouragement to you. I'd love to visit more with you if that's something that you want to discuss in greater detail. Or if you have a question, remember the chat room. So, all right, if we were live, I'd try to read your faces a little bit better, but all I see right now is Don and Bruce and Lori, and so we'll keep moving. All right, good. Attribute number 3, third attribute of a generous church. Generous churches have a strong external focus to make a difference in their community and the world that's reflected in their budget. For years, if you've heard me talk, you've heard me talk about first fruits. And when I talk about generosity, I think that's a key principle for us as individuals, because there's so much in there. And I'll try not to get off track here and start preaching, but Proverbs 3:9 and the principle of first fruits, giving to God of our first and best. Okay, and I think it's so important that as churches, we also have a similar perspective that as a church, as a corporate entity, we're also going to give of our first fruits to make a difference in our community and to make a difference in our world. And that's what we're talking about here. So a lot of things connected to be able to articulate our vision and let people know that as you express your generosity, this is a place that God is active and he's doing something and we're on board, and we'd love for you to jump on board with us. I love a phrase. I'm reflecting back on Stan from Cape and Krause a number of times, but he asked this question of our churches: would anyone miss you if you were gone? I love that. I think that's a thing that we think about personally. We go to a funeral, not that you can go to a funeral these days, but we go to a funeral, we have a loved one pass away, and we begin that self-reflection, and we wonder, what will be said about us? Will anyone miss us? We get a little nostalgic and all that, but have you thought about that for your church? See, if we don't have a strong external focus into our community and into the world, the only one that's going to miss us if our church ever were to close, and I hope it doesn't happen, but it's just a way to think this through. Only our congregants will miss us. Yeah, if Parkview USMB closed, I would miss it. But would neighborhoods that don't go to church miss it in Hillsboro? Would the community miss it? Would people around the world miss it because of missional support and impact? And I'd say the answer is yes. So if Pastor Tom's online, I'm all on board. But that's a question, a diagnostic question for you to ask as you think about would anyone miss us? Do we have a strong enough focus on things that are outside of our own little family that meets together weekly? And if you're looking for suggestions on how to have an external focus, great webinar yesterday. Thank you, Boris. And you could go back and listen to that. Get in touch with Boris Borisov. Excellent work helping our churches think through how can we make a difference in our community. So that's enough to be said on that one. Number 4, generous churches teach people a holistic theology of stewardship, generosity, and the kingdom. That's a mouthful. But we need to talk about more than giving. We need to talk about whole life stewardship. We need to make the connection to the kingdom. And I think a key piece here, I'm just going to move right into the best practice, is to emphasize generosity as an act of worship. Okay, so we don't lead with, we need your money. We don't lead with duty and obligation. We lead with, and the overarching DNA and culture of our church should be that generosity is an act of worship. So even as we're talking about making the ask and all these other things, let's make sure that kind of overrides. So diagnose your own church. How does that get fleshed out? How in your teaching does that come through? We can't just be satisfied that if we play a beautiful offertory and have a moment of prayer, that it's going to be worship. It might be, and those might be good elements, but there might be some other things that we need to teach, practice, and experience together. I mean, I wonder how many fights happen on the way to church because we forget the check, and so we start the blame game, and or how many gifts are made impromptu during the offering time, and there's no worship. It's just kind of a knee-jerk reaction. So we have to think through, how are we leading our congregation to give as an act of worship? And as we move into a digital age, more and more online giving, how do we ensure that our worship isn't just some technical thing we do, just like paying all of our other bills, but that it's an act of worship? And I'm still learning on this, because this is new ground for me. I've led a lot of worship services. I've thought about it a lot in that face-to-face, giving in the offering plate or in the bag, and doing that together in community. But it's still new for me in terms of the digital piece. And so I'd love to hear from some of you. Maybe we can get some chat going, or you'd be ready to chime in here in a minute and talk about how are you helping to ensure that giving is an act of worship, even as your church moves more and more into a digital giving, electronic payment, electronic giving. I've noticed I don't know if you're doing what I'm doing, but while we were in the stay home order and not meeting together in church, I was checking out other services. So I'd attend our service, but then check out other services too. And I just noticed that a number of churches were struggling with how to incorporate incorporate the giving as worship as part of their online service. Did I say that clearly? So because we're not meeting together, and so we don't have an offertory, and we don't pass the bag or pass the plate, then we just aren't talking about the offering or worship or generosity at all. Now, some of those, started figuring it out. They were pivoting. They were trying to be innovative, but why remove giving as an act of corporate worship just because we're not meeting together face to face? So here's one suggestion that I would give to you, is that we need to have a giving moment. Especially if you're not meeting together face to face, you're doing online worship services, but even as we meet face to face, maybe we can incorporate this more. A giving moment could include, for example, someone getting up and sharing a testimony of generosity. Expressing maybe a step they've taken in generosity, a time when they saw a need and helped to fill it, or a time when they increased their giving to the local church, and what a blessing that was. And I know this can be kind of dicey. We're very concerned about testimonies around generosity, but I think we can evaluate whether or not this person has the right heart and the right message, and they can be really powerful to encourage people in their generosity. So connecting a testimony to the offering, or having a church leader or ministry leader share about the impact or benefit of the corporate generosity. So in our church, we've been doing a lot of mission moments. We do a lot of videos and interviews of missionaries around the world. We could probably do a better job at connecting those with the offering time. They stand on their own, but we could also talk about the worship and the privilege of participating, and this is where our dollars go, or a portion of it. And so we have to think again, we have to be innovative, we have to think strategically, and I think this is one way to emphasize giving as worship, even while we get a little bit more disconnected in some of our giving corporately together. Thanks, Lynn, for your chat there about the church ministry funding guide. If anybody hasn't seen that, he's got a link to it that we provided a number of weeks ago. Many great ideas on many of the topics that we're covering here today. I'd be interested in stopping just for a moment if there's anyone that can unmute and have a story to share or a question specifically around this best practice. How do we help people be generous even as we move through different forms of offering and giving, especially during this time of more and more online digital giving? Anybody have something to share? I think you can unmute yourself, right, Lori? She says yes. So if you go to the lower left hand, you can make a comment.
Maybe while we're waiting for those to come in, John, I'm kind of reminded of your other 2 points about the external focus and the innovation from the USA Today article, and reminded of some of these churches that have been offering hot meals to people in need and being able to express that. Seems like an opportunity here, like impact benefit of our generosity. A giving moment could be, we distributed, or we're a part of distributing 300 meals this week, and that was possible because of your generosity, your giving to the church, because we were able to extend that hot meal to somebody in need. Would be one way of kind of having one of those giving moments that you're talking about.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. I don't know what we keep seeing these stories of people that are doing different hobbies and different projects because they're staying home and they have nothing to do. I still haven't hit that season, so I don't think most of our pastors have either. And so ministry has continued or even increased, and we just need to tell those stories and connect people's generosity and their involvement to some of those things that are going on. Yeah, any other comments? Anyone else? We'll move on. You can save that for the end, and we want to make sure that we get done on time. Okay, let's go to number 5, Bruce. 5th attribute of a generous church. Generous churches provide discipleship environments for people to work out the art and science of stewardship and generosity. Again, another mouthful, but we're getting at a number of things here that stewardship isn't just about having the right spreadsheet or having the right, disciplines in place or in front of you. It's also about our heart. There's an art to it. There's a motivation to it. There's a, worldview to it. So there's those 2 things going on. I think this also speaks to the fact that most of our churches have people in a variety of economic situations. And so we have people that are really struggling, and maybe they need a certain type of teaching, and we can't hit it all from the pulpit. So, maybe a Dave Ramsey, yes, believe it or not, I just said Dave Ramsey, Financial Peace, might help people that are struggling to get out of debt and really grab hold and finally, make some changes in their life. But then there's also people that are in a solid financial condition or even in a surplus. Yeah, there's people in your church that have a surplus, and maybe they need to read, David Green's Giving It All Away book to really be motivated at a different level, to get some different stewardship principles in place. Then, of course, we've got people at different life stages, and that calls for different stewardship training, the art and the science of stewardship. So you've got young people, you've got young marrieds, you've got families, you've got boomers, you've got people later in life. They all have different issues. And so our churches it's a challenge, especially for the younger churches, to figure out how to address all that. You've got limited staff, limited teaching opportunities, but at some level we need to be thinking about how do we provide the right environment to help people grow as disciples in this area of stewardship, financial management, et cetera. And a perfect example of it is what we're faced with right now with the pandemic, is the shift to more online giving. And, we could have done that years ago to help address the younger people in our churches that just want that option that meets their needs. But instead, we have some churches where, a lot of older folks saying, no, we don't need that. But it would have been an opportunity to use science and technology and innovation just to make it easier for them to be generous with the younger people. So Bruce, tell us a little bit about what we found in our survey.
Yeah, we're real curious about how many churches offered online giving prior to the pandemic. And so the survey came back, said 55% of our MB churches offered online giving prior to that time. And then with the pandemic, it's forced or inspired so much more online activity, everything from buying food, ordering supplies, having church services. It's really inspired, like Jon said, a digital shift. And so it even inspired some moving towards online giving. So 76% will offer online giving going forward. So there has been an increase in our MB churches as far as offering this avenue for living out your faith through generosity, and adding another avenue to make that happen. But it also means then on the flip side that 20, 24, 23% are not offering online giving. And so there seems to be an opportunity there to get into that phase like Jon is talking about.
Yeah, thanks. So I think here's the best practice I think we all need to embrace. So I'm speaking more to the 24%, but maybe to all of us, there's always something new we can do when it comes to digital giving, electronic giving, use whatever word you want, giving on your website, giving through a text message. Like I say, there's lots of different ways to implement this, but best practice that I would recommend is everybody needs to embrace digital giving in the form that's appropriate for your church, but you've got to find a way. And so I'm telling a lot about my personal church experience, but Parkview Church a number of years ago started electronic giving, but they just did it in conjunction with a local bank who would help facilitate. It was a very non-digital way, but yet it shifts funds electronically. But then they took another step because of the pandemic and have a new online system that would be more consistent with what most of us would expect with an online experience. So this is something that we just need to do. And I'm showing my age a little bit when I say that I've been a little slow to get on board, but the pandemic has helped me get on board. And my hesitation has been the fact that I think it's harder to communicate giving as worship when we do it digitally. But some are proving me wrong on that. So I confess that. I'm working through it just like you're working through it. We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We just have to keep working at both. We have to keep working and making sure that people are giving out of worship, and we need to also provide options. And it will help us during a time of a pandemic. There's many other reasons it could help us. We're finding that as you went to online services, I'm sure you've heard the stories and you've experienced the stories. We're hearing that churches, the viewership of your live stream, your whatever it is that you're doing to have your service online is getting many more people watching than are actually part of your church. If you have no digital way for them to give, then they can't really engage in your service. If they want to just make a thank you gift, $5, $10, and just, thank you for the word of encouragement today. It was good to be part of your service. You need an online option. Or what if they really get inspired by the vision of your church and want to make a more significant gift? I'd love to know if anyone's seen some of that kind of gifting going on. I'd love to hear those stories. We also know that we're observing that churches that already had an online mechanism for giving are weathering this pandemic a little bit easier than others. And so I just encourage every one of our churches, and there's many other benefits to going online, but I think for the sake of time, we'll move on. Is there a question here that we need to address? Yeah, Don, thanks for that question. Yeah, I'd be interested, and I think everybody can read the chat. How do we address those churches that struggle getting past the 3% fee for online giving? It causes some churches not to. So I'm going to delve into some of my other stats. Thanks, Don, that I was going to skip over. But one thing, there are many people who skip one of their regular offerings when they go on vacation. They never make it up. And so if you have a church where some of our churches, people are gone for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and you miss all that offering. If they have a digital gift in place, an online gift that's reoccurring, then it just continues even though they've been on vacation or they went on a mission trip or whatever, or they're snowbirds or whatever it is that they do. It just continues unhaltered. So that systematic giving will increase your revenue, and instead of decrease it and be focused on that 3% fee, which is generally in place when you use digital giving of any kind. We also find that digital givers tend to donate more and more often than other folks. So this is research that I've run across. They said that digital givers give $17 per donor per week, and non-digital givers give $10 per donor per week. So that makes up the 3% difference right there, and actually doubles the benefit. They also report that digital givers are 5 times more likely to still be giving a year later than other donors. So that's huge. That's huge. 5 times more likely to continue in their giving if they get on board with the reoccurring digital gifts. So there's a couple pieces that address that fee concern. And that's just a part of doing business. You know the retail store that used to not let you use credit card because of that fee that they have to pay. And today they just know. I mean, it's just part of business, and it's part of where the world's going. And so we need to embrace it. We'll keep going. Number 6, generous churches develop an organizational culture that supports the priesthood of the believers. So this should be easy for us as Anabaptists. But what we're getting at here mostly is that as you engage people in leadership, in volunteerism, in service, and I know this is what all of our churches are going for, but as you engage them in significant ways, they're going to be more likely to contribute to the ministry of the local church. And in fact, the reverse is also true. Crown Financial has reported for decades that as people increase their local church giving, they get more involved in ministry. So both of them support this notion that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. A pretty good word for us. So that's what we're talking about there. And I think with that, we'll move on to number 7, so we make sure we allow some time for questions or discussion here at the end. Number 7, generous churches steward the church finances effectively. So we have a stewardship, a trust that's given to us as church leaders, trustees, treasurer, elders, pastors, whoever's in charge of the church finances. It's a sacred trust. That's the way we view the money that comes into MB Foundation. It's the way that you need to view it as well. And if you want to grow faithful stewards, this is another opportunity for the church corporately just to show what it looks like to be a good steward, to manage resources well. We spent a whole webinar on that a couple weeks ago, so we don't need to take a deep dive, but we need to take this seriously. We can't just be, not have any accountability, not have any reporting, not have any systems in place like any business would that's managing, whether it's $100,000 a year of revenue or whether it's $1 million a year of revenue. We need to steward those finances in effective ways. So one of the ways we can steward resources well is reflected by how much we have in savings, and that's an item that we surveyed. So Bruce, why don't you give us a little bit on that?
Yeah, the survey reported 65% of MB churches had cash reserves of 3 months or more prior to the crisis. So they went into the pandemic with some margin, with some reserves that maybe helped them retain staff, helped them extend ministry. With that cushion, I'm guessing things were just maybe a little bit easier. 12% reported they had no reserves going in the pandemic. So I can only imagine how that increased the pressure on those leaders and on those churches. And as a result, perhaps decrease the impact. So again, talking here today about how do we increase impact through generosity. One of those ways might be stewarding our resources well, including our savings.
Yeah, so this has been a point of learning for me, and I'm still trying to sort through it. For a lot of years, I have recommended 6 weeks of reserve up to 3 months. That's kind of been my standard to churches, my standard advice. And I think that's been kind of industry standard, although you might hear some outliers. But and we've had the discussions about, well, shouldn't we just live on faith as a local church? When does it become hoarding? And we need to have those discussions. But one issue I hadn't thought about was, will we be properly positioned as a church if a local crisis happens, let alone a world pandemic? That was beyond my thinking and my thought process. Are the Hillsborough MB churches properly poised so that if something drastic happened, even locally, that we could respond and not just be living on faith? It's the same issue as for us as individuals. We'd recommend even more savings than 6 weeks to 3 months, so that you can respond and care for your family, take care of needs, even if you become unemployed and a crisis happens, just like we've been experiencing. So some things to think about there. Again, a lot more we could say. Great webinar a few weeks ago, as well as that paper that came up in the chat, some resources that could help you in an area that we can talk with you more about as well, one-on-one if you'd like to. But a best practice I want to bring up in this area is something that may be a little bit of a stretch for us. And that is that I think our churches have to think more like our colleges would think, like other parachurch ministries think, and cultivate our donors better. It gets back to one of the earlier attributes that we talked about, and that is that people can be very generous and still not express that generosity within the local church because they get thanked more elsewhere, or because they think there's more vision and more reason to give in other places. So this is one of those things that can kind of help confront that. So how can we cultivate our donors? Well, when's the last time the church sent a thank you note after someone makes a gift? But you know as well as I do that if you make a gift to a parachurch ministry, you're going to get a receipt pretty timely. You might even get a sentence or two from the president. What if your parishioners got a thank you note from the youth pastor that talked about, connected to the ministry that's happening as a result of the giving? Or what if a missionary sent a thank you note and said, your church faithfully supports us, and so I thank you for contributing to this pie, and a portion of that, is sent on to us. Whatever that could look like. And I know there's all kinds of things we can discuss about left hand, right hand, and those things. But I think there are ways we can implement better cultivation of our donors to help encourage people to think and prioritize giving to the local church. Of course, the other things I've talked about in terms of connecting vision to their giving and the ministry to their giving, educating on generosity, those all tie in here too. But just giving some attention, you might think about how can we cultivate our donors a little bit better? How can we say thank you better? How can we connect for them their gift to the impact that they're making through those gifts? So that's a mouthful. I feel like I've gone really fast. I hope it's come through okay. We'd love to take some questions and see if we can handle them, or see if there's someone else in the group that could speak to it. Here's a great question. So I'm just going to address it from Rhonda in the chat room. How many churches in the survey were our traditional English-speaking congregations, and how many were our ethnic congregations? So great question. And I almost brought it up earlier because I felt like it should be stated. I don't have the exact numbers. I could get them, but we chose not to slice it up that way at this point. But most of it was from our English-speaking churches, the vast majority. So I think when we, some of those stats, when we talk about the financial health, the you know, the layoffs in our churches and some of those things would look very different if we had a greater participation in the survey from some of the ethnic groups that where English is a barrier. And so we didn't give the effort to translate the questionnaire, and so that's on us. We knew that we'd get primarily we'd get responses from people that could engage with the English version well. We did get some responses from the Hispanic community, I think an Ethiopian church or two and a Slavic church or two, but not a lot. But we had almost 70 responses overall, so pretty high participation rate from our English-speaking churches. Any other questions, comments? Tom, you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In your number one, you talked about generous churches are led by generous leaders. I've heard some finance consultants for churches say that you should know what your leaders are giving. And that gets into a pretty sticky situation, but he talked of instances where the person who was chairing the committee for for a finance campaign, or maybe even chairing a finance committee, they dug in and found out they were giving very little. And even though no one in the church knew that, most of them assumed they were giving much. When they replaced that person, suddenly the finances got better, or the work was successful. So do you have any experience in whether we should know who in our leadership is giving or not? Or, is that something we should hold people accountable to at that level where they have to tell us? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've answered that question poorly a number of times. So I'll answer it poorly one more time. It's tough, and I have also recommended that, but I've also recommended that we keep it in context with, what other spiritual disciplines would you want to hold leadership accountable to? And not in a rule-oriented way, but in terms of your evaluation. Like if you're going to be an elder, I want to have some assessment of whether or not you're engaged in the Word, and whether or not you have a healthy marriage if you're married, and what would be some of the other measurement tools or areas that you'd want to have in place. So rather than just highlighting finances or generosity, I think that's one of them. And I do think that we hold on to too much about giving in the closet and praying and that scripture in Matthew, and left hand know what the right hand's doing. I'll tell you what, my left hand always knows what my right hand is doing. I mean, so that, again, we not go too far there, but I think it can be helpful. But I also have advised pastors, leaders that I'm talking to, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Make sure your own heart is in the right place, and you got to know your own tendencies, your own temptations, your own judgments. And if you're asking the question for the wrong reason, then the problem is with you. And so you just got to be really careful. Pastors ask whether or not they should know what people are giving, and similar kind of response. Boy, why do you want to know? And yet I really advocate for people, pastors, leadership, knowing kind of groupings of how people are giving, maybe not specifically what people are giving. I think that's wrought with some danger. But I don't think there's anything wrong with asking leaders or potential leaders, how do you do in your devotional life? How are you doing in this area? How are you doing in your giving? And letting them respond to that.
Thanks, John.
John, you may have to move quickly, but there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Which one do you think I should take?
One from Donaldo and one from Phil Wiebe.
Okay, from Donaldo, trying to understand the context. If you're saying, how does the church steward finances, even when a lot of the income comes in right at the beginning of the year? If that's the perspective, how does the church address this type of giver? Well, I don't think you spend the money as fast as it comes in. So a best practice in terms of church finances is estimate the giving and even look at the timing of the giving. We have other people that give at the end of the year and a significant amount comes in. Well, don't wait till Christmas to spend it either. Have a cushion so that your expenses can flow as they need to according to ministry, but hold back on those gifts that come in earlier and budget well and spend it in a wise way throughout the year according to your spending plan. So hopefully that helps you.
We'll end with Phil's question.
Good, thanks. Would you say a thank you note helps us celebrate the spiritual gift of giving? Yeah, I think it does. I think that the struggle with even the thank you note idea is some donors will say, oh, does that person now know what I gave? And so we might have to kind of preempt even a practice like this with maybe some new communication of, we want to say thank you, but the treasurer is going to say who gave, and that they need a thank you note, not how much they gave. And so we could maybe cover some of that, but I do think it helps us celebrate the spiritual gift of giving. And there are lots of taboos and probably more that I can address, but let's not be afraid of some of these things because of some of the negatives. Let's just manage them well and be strategic and innovative in how we deal with it.
I might add one thing back. I might add one more thing to Donaldo's point, referencing back to the webinar we had a few weeks ago with Stan at Cape and Krause, who was really advocating for budgeting on a weekly basis during this time and tracking on a weekly basis as a way of building your budget because things are changing so quickly. That might address, okay, we've received some gifts. Do we need to spend them now, or do we know some expenses that are coming up, and how might that change? So
let's go to our next slide really quick. That's a good word, Bruce, and I know Don's concerned about the time, but here, mbfoundation.com/increasing impact. So if you go to that website, or else email me or Bruce if you didn't get it, but we've got the white paper, we've got the survey results, the executive summary, and there's our email. So take note in the white paper, a short assessment. So you can ask yourself, is our church generous? And answer a half dozen questions and see how you grade yourself. So thanks so much, Don. Sorry we went over by a couple minutes.
No, that's fine. Thank you, John. Thank you, Bruce. Really appreciate it. A lot of very, very good stuff. And so this is being recorded, and it will be on our website, USMB.org, sometime soon. And as well as the slides would be available as well, either through MB Foundation, or we'll also have them on the U.S. Conference website. So again, thank you. And the next session will start at 1 o'clock Central, and that will be the main business session, and you don't want to miss that. A lot of good things besides just business, a lot of good reporting and celebrating what God's doing among us as MBs. And then at 3:30, those of you that are in small city towns, rural context, you don't want to miss the webinar from Ron Clausen on increasing our impact in through the town and country church. And so I'm looking forward to that as well. Let's end in prayer, and then we'll let you go. Lord, thank you for what we've learned today. And Lord, I know you desire for us to be generous. You talk about it throughout the Gospels, and you have led us to be those kinds of people. So Lord, I pray that you would help us, not only as churches, but as individuals, to be generous and to see the needs around us and to help to meet those needs. So Lord, thanks for blessing us through this, and we look forward to your blessing over the coming session at 1 o'clock. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all, and we'll see you at 1 o'clock Central.